The 72-year-old woman lost control with her plumber. When I opened the door that fateful afternoon, I wasn't prepared for the man who would change my life. Jake stood there, all broad shoulders and warm eyes, with a toolbox in hand and a charm that disarmed me instantly. At 72, I thought my days of romance and adventure were long behind me, buried beneath years of routine and solitude. But as the days turned into weeks and our connection deepened, I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew about love, life, and second chances. What happens when the past resurfaces, threatening the fragile happiness we've built? When the knock on the door came that afternoon, I had no idea my life was about to change forever. I adjusted my cardigan, the familiar ache in my joints reminding me of my age, and shuffled to the front door. Standing there, bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun, was Jake. His presence startled me, not because I wasn't expecting him, but because he was more than I imagined. Taller, younger, and undeniably handsome, with an air of rugged confidence that made my breath hitch. His tool belt hung low around his hips, the leather worn from years of honest work. "Mrs. Harris?" he asked, his voice a smooth baritone that carried a friendly warmth. "Yes, that's me," I replied, gripping the doorframe a little tighter. "You must be Jake." He smiled, a slow, easy grin that revealed the dimples in his cheeks. "Here to take a look at that sink of yours." I nodded, stepping aside to let him in. As he moved past me, the faint scent of cedar wood and clean soap trailed in his wake. I felt ridiculous for noticing, but something about his presence made me hyper-aware of details I hadn't thought about in years. Jake's steps carried him confidently into my kitchen, a room that had grown cold and unused in the years since my husband George passed. He set his toolbox on the counter and immediately began unpacking it, his hands deft and sure. I busied myself with rearranging the vase of flowers on the windowsill, though it hardly needed fixing. Truthfully, I couldn't stop watching him. "Looks like the pipes rusted through," he said, his voice pulling me out of my thoughts. He glanced over his shoulder, catching me mid-stare. "Nothing I can't handle, though." A blush crept up my cheeks. "That's a relief. I was worried it might be worse." He chuckled softly, the sound rich and low. "Most things just need a little care and attention, Mrs. Harris. Like this house. It's got character. You don't see places like this anymore." I smiled, caught off guard by the sincerity in his voice. "Thank you. It's been in the family for decades. My husband loved taking care of it when he was alive." Jake's expression softened. "I'm sorry for your loss." The words hung between us for a moment, heavy but not uncomfortable. There was something in his tone that felt genuine, almost understanding. Before I could reply, he turned back to his work, giving me the space to collect myself. By the time Jake finished the repairs, the room felt different. Warmer, somehow, though I couldn't tell if it was the light streaming through the window or something else entirely. "All done," he announced, packing up his tools. "I'll pick up the parts I need for the faucet and come back tomorrow to finish the job." "Thank you," I said, following him to the door. "It's been nice having someone around. This house gets awfully quiet." He paused, his hand on the doorknob. "I can imagine. But you've made it feel welcoming. I'll see you tomorrow, Mrs. Harris." As I watched his truck pull out of the driveway, I felt a flutter in my chest, a strange, fleeting sensation I hadn't experienced in years. It was foolish, I told myself, shaking my head. I was 72 years old, a widow, a grandmother, And yet, the quiet house suddenly felt even emptier than before. I tightened my cardigan around my shoulders as I shuffled toward the door, the ache in my knees a constant companion. Standing there, framed by the golden afternoon light, was a man who seemed to belong more to the pages of a magazine than the doorstep of a 72-year-old widow. He was tall and broad, his tool belt hanging low around his hips, and a boyish grin softening the sharpness of his features. "Mrs. Harris?" His voice was warm and rich, carrying a friendliness that instantly put me at ease. "Yes," I said, suddenly aware of the faint tremor in my hands. "You must be Jake." "That's me." He adjusted the strap of his bag over one shoulder and gestured toward my kitchen. "Here to fix that sink of yours." I stepped aside to let him in, and as he passed, a subtle scent of cedar wood and soap filled the air. I stood there for a moment, watching as he made his way to the kitchen, his easy confidence seeming almost out of place in my quiet, lived-in home. Jake set his bag down and crouched beneath the sink, his movements fluid and efficient. The sight of him bent over the cabinet stirred something in me, something I couldn't quite place. I told myself it was nostalgia, a fleeting memory of George, my late husband, who used to tinker with the plumbing on weekends. "Looks like you've got a corroded pipe here," Jake said, his voice pulling me back to the present. He leaned back on his heels and glanced over his shoulder, catching me mid-stare. "Nothing we can't handle, though." "Oh, that's a relief," I said, feeling a blush creep up my cheeks. I was worried it might be worse. He flashed a grin that revealed deep dimples. "Nah, nothing too serious. Just need some TLC. Kind of like this place. It's got good bones, you know? A lot of character." He nodded, unsure how to respond. "It's been in the family for years. My husband always took care of the repairs." My voice wavered slightly, but I smiled to cover it. He loved this house. Jake's expression softened. "I'm sorry for your loss. Must be hard keeping everything up on your own." "It has been," I admitted, surprising myself with the honesty. "But you find ways to manage. Life goes on, doesn't it?" He nodded, his gaze steady. "It does." The rest of the afternoon passed in a rhythm that felt strangely comfortable. While Jake worked, I busied myself with small tasks, wiping down countertops, rearranging the flowers in the vase by the window. I caught myself glancing at him more often than I should have, drawn to the quiet confidence in his movements and the occasional hum of a tune under his breath. "All done," Jake announced, snapping his toolbox shut. "I'll need to grab a replacement part for the faucet, but I can come back tomorrow to finish the job." "Thank you," I said, walking him to the door. "You've been a big help already." He paused before stepping out, his gaze meeting mine. "It's no trouble, Mrs. Harris. See you tomorrow." As I watched his truck pull out of the driveway, I felt a strange flutter in my chest, a feeling I hadn't experienced in years. I shook my head, chastising myself for the foolishness of it. But even as I closed the door and returned to the stillness of the house, I couldn't shake the warmth Jake had left behind. The next morning, I woke with an energy I hadn't felt in ages. I put on a nicer blouse, brushed out my silver hair, and even dabbed a bit of perfume on my wrists. It was silly, really. He was just the plumber. Still, I found myself glancing at the clock more than usual, waiting for the familiar rumble of his truck in the driveway. When Jake arrived, his easy smile and casual charm were enough to make me forget my self-consciousness. He worked quickly, the clink of tools filling the kitchen as we chatted about little things. His daughter, Lily, who was 8 and already a budding artist, and my grandchildren, who visited far less often than I'd like. "You must miss them," he said, his voice tinged with empathy. "I do," I admitted, "but that's life, isn't it? They've got their own lives now, and I've got mine." Jake nodded, his hand steady as he tightened a pipe. "Still, it's good to have people around. Makes a place feel alive." His words stayed with me long after he left that afternoon, the house feeling quieter and emptier than it had before. That night, as I sat in the living room with a book I wasn't really reading, I found myself thinking about Jake. His voice, his laugh, the way he seemed to fill the room with an effortless ease. It was ridiculous, I told myself, but for the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't just waiting for time to pass. The next day, Jake returned with a replacement part for the sink. The rumble of his truck pulling into the driveway sent a small thrill through me, though I quickly busied myself rearranging a vase of flowers to hide the fact that I'd been waiting by the window. By the time I opened the door, I'd composed myself, though my heart betrayed me by skipping a beat at the sight of him. "Morning, Mrs. Harris," Jake said with a grin, holding up the faucet as if it were a trophy. "This should do the trick." "Nothing helps like doing this with you," Jake said, as he grabbed a spoon from the sink and began to force the water into the sink. "Good morning, Jake," I replied, stepping aside to let him in. "And please, just call me Margaret." "Mrs. Harris makes me feel ancient." "Margaret it is," he said, his grin widening. As Jake worked on the sink, I found myself lingering in the kitchen longer than necessary. I brewed a fresh pot of tea, set out a plate of biscuits, and even pretended to check the grocery list stuck to the fridge. Anything to stay close to the steady rhythm of his presence. "Done," Jake announced after a while, turning on the faucet to demonstrate the steady flow of water. "Good as new." "Thank you," I said, genuinely relieved. "I don't know how I'd manage without your help." "You'd figure it out," he replied, leaning against the counter. "You seem like the resourceful type." I smiled at the compliment, though I couldn't help but wonder if he really saw me that way. "Would you like some tea before you go?" Jake glanced at his watch. "I'd like that, actually. Thanks." We sat at the small kitchen table, the silence between us easy and unhurried. Jake sipped his tea, his large hands dwarfing the delicate china cup, and I found myself studying the lines of his face. The sharp angle of his jaw, the faint stubble on his cheeks, the way his eye seemed to hold both strength and kindness. "You've got a knack for making a place feel cozy," Jake said, breaking the silence. "It's nice to be somewhere that feels warm, you know." I blinked, surprised by his candor. I suppose I've had a lot of time to figure out what makes me comfortable. The house didn't always feel this way, though. Jake tilted his head, his gaze curious. "What changed?" I hesitated, unsure if I should share something so personal, but there was something about Jake, his openness, his lack of judgment, that made me want to be honest. After George passed, the house felt empty, hollow. I didn't know how to fill the space he left behind. It took a long time to realize I needed to make it my own, in a way that brought me peace. Jake nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I get that. When Lily's mom left, it was just me and her. The house felt too big for the two of us. It took a while to make it feel like home again." "How's Lily?" I asked, eager to shift the focus back to him. His face softened instantly. "She's great. Smart as a whip and bossy as they come. She's into painting these days." I hung one of her masterpieces in the living room. It's a blob of blue and green, but to her, it's a dragon. I laughed, the sound feeling light and unfamiliar in my own ears. Sounds like she's got a creative streak. She does, he said, his smile fading slightly. I just hope I'm doing right by her. Some days, I feel like I'm barely holding it together. You're doing better than you think, I said gently. The fact that you care so much says everything. Jake looked at me, his gaze lingering in a way that made my heart race. You're easy to talk to, Margaret. I don't think I've ever opened up like this before. I swallowed, unsure how to respond. The air between us felt charged, and for a moment, I thought he might say something else, something that would tip us into uncharted territory. But then he stood, brushing his hands on his jeans. I should get going, he said, his voice a little quieter than before. Thanks for the tea. Any time, I replied, walking him to the door. And Jake? Ugh. I meant what I said. You're doing a good job with Lily and everything else. He smiled, and for a brief second, the world seemed to narrow to just the two of us. Thanks, Margaret. That means a lot. As his truck disappeared down the street, I stood at the door, my hand lingering on the frame. Something had shifted between us, though I wasn't sure what. All I knew was that the house felt impossibly quiet without him in it. The days that followed were both thrilling and unsettling. Jake began stopping by more often, not just to finish repairs, but to chat, to share a cup of tea, or to lend a hand with whatever small task I'd invented to keep him around. We fell into an easy rhythm, our conversations flowing naturally from light-hearted banter to moments of startling vulnerability. One afternoon, as we planted a new rose bush in the garden, Jake glanced at me and said, You know, Margaret, you've got more energy than most people half your age. I laughed, brushing dirt from my gloves. Flattery will get you everywhere. I mean it, he said, his tone serious. You're incredible. I hope I have half your spirit when I'm your age. I froze, caught off guard by the sincerity in his voice. For a moment, I couldn't bring myself to look at him. Thank you, Jake. That means more than you know. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur, the warmth of his words lingering long after he'd gone. I found myself replaying the moment in my mind, wondering if I'd imagined the intensity of his gaze or the softness in his tone. One evening, as a thunderstorm rolled in, Jake showed up at my door, his hair damp from the rain. I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd check on that gutter we fixed, he said, though the sheepish grin on his face suggested otherwise. You're soaked, I exclaimed, ushering him inside. Let me grab you a towel. He cried out the name. By the time he'd dried off and warmed up with a cup of tea, the storm had grown too fierce for him to leave. Looks like I'm stuck here for a while, Jake said, his tone apologetic but his eyes gleaming with something else. It's no trouble, I assured him, though my heart was pounding in my chest. I could use the company. We sat together on the couch, the sound of rain pounding against the windows creating a cocoon of intimacy. Jake told me stories about his childhood, about summers spent at his grandparents' farm, about the time he'd accidentally let a pig loose in the kitchen. I laughed so hard my sides hurt, the sound of my own joy surprising me. When the laughter subsided, a comfortable silence settled between us. Jake leaned back against the couch, his arm resting on the back of it, and I found myself drawn to the warmth of his presence. My hand brushed against his as I reached for my tea, and I felt a spark that made me gasp quietly. Margaret, he said softly, his voice low and steady. I don't know what's happening between us, but it feels different, special. I turned to him, my breath catching. Jake, Before I could finish, the power flickered, plunging the room into darkness. I felt his hand close over mine, steadying me in the sudden void. And in that moment, the world seemed to pause, leaving only the sound of the storm and the quiet rhythm of our breathing. When the lights flickered back on, I pulled my hand away, suddenly hyper-aware of the closeness between us. The air felt heavy, charged with something I wasn't ready to name. "I should check on the circuit breaker," Jake said, his voice slightly hoarse. He stood abruptly, and I nodded, grateful for the excuse to put some distance between us. While he disappeared into the hallway, I busied myself in the kitchen, my hands trembling as I rinsed our empty mugs. I stared at the running water, trying to make sense of the emotions swirling inside me. What was I doing? What were we doing? This wasn't just a casual friendship anymore. Something deeper was unfolding, and it terrified me as much as it thrilled me. Halfway through the wash, a scraping sound drew my attention. "Everything looks fine," Jake said, reappearing in the doorway. His hair was still damp, curling slightly at the ends, and he looked younger somehow, more vulnerable. The storm must have caused a surge. "Good," I said, though my voice came out weaker than I intended. "Thank you." He stepped closer, hesitating as if he wanted to say something. "Margaret, about earlier." "It's fine," I interrupted quickly, forcing a smile. "Nothing to worry about." But it was something to worry about. I could see it in his eyes, the way his brows knit together as he searched my face. I could feel it in the erratic beat of my heart, in the way my hands clutched the edge of the counter for support. I wasn't fine, and neither was he. But I wasn't ready to admit it, not to him, and not to myself. The storm passed by morning, leaving behind a sky so blue it felt almost mocking. Jake left early, his goodbye brief and awkward, and the house seemed emptier than ever in his absence. I told myself I needed the space, the quiet, to think. But the silence only amplified the questions I was too afraid to answer. What did I want? What did he want? And more importantly, what would people think? The last question haunted me the most. I imagined the judgmental whispers of my neighbors, the disapproving looks from my children, the endless barrage of questions I wouldn't know how to answer. Jake was younger than my youngest son, for heaven's sake. The very idea of us was absurd, laughable even. And yet, when I thought about him, his easy laugh, his kind eyes, the way he made me feel alive, I couldn't bring myself to laugh. I could only hope. Days turned into a week and I didn't hear from Jake. The distance should have been a relief, a chance to regain my footing. Instead, it felt like a punishment. I checked my phone more times than I cared to admit, hoping for a text, a call, anything to break the silence. But none came. By the time the weekend arrived, I was ready to admit defeat. Whatever spark had existed between us had fizzled out, and perhaps it was for the best. I had lived without romance for over a decade. I could do it again. And then the knock came. I opened the door to find Jake standing there, holding a small potted plant. His expression was hesitant, almost shy, and my heart ached at the sight of him. "I realized I never finished planting those roses," he said, holding up the plant as if it were a peace offering. "Figured I'd make it up to you." I stepped aside, my voice caught somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "Come in." We spent the afternoon in the garden, our hands working side by side in the dirt. The conversation was lighter than usual, safe, careful. But the unspoken tension between us lingered. When the last rose bush was in the ground, Jake leaned back on his heels, wiping sweat from his brow. There, he said, his tone almost triumphant. That should do it. I smiled, brushing soil from my gloves. It's beautiful, thank you. He stood, his gaze lingering on the newly planted roses before shifting to me. Margaret, I owe you an apology. For what? I asked, genuinely confused. For avoiding you, he admitted, his voice low. I didn't know what to say after that night. I didn't want to make things awkward. You didn't, I said quickly, though we both knew it wasn't entirely true. I've been avoiding it too. But maybe we should stop. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and the weight of his gaze was almost too much to bear. What are we doing, Margaret? I don't know, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. But I know I don't want to lose whatever this is. He stepped closer, his presence both grounding and electrifying. Neither do I. For a moment, neither of us moved, the space between us filled with 1,000 possibilities. And then, slowly, he reached for my hand, his fingers warm and steady against my own. Can I take you to dinner? He asked softly. I blinked, startled by the question. Dinner? Yeah, he said, his smile returning. You know, a real date, just you and me. I hesitated, the weight of his words sinking in. A date. Something so simple, so ordinary, and yet so monumental. Did I have the courage to say yes? Still, I answered him mightily. I'd like that, I said finally, the words surprising even me. Jake's smile widened, his dimples deepening. Good. It's a date. Our first date was nothing like I expected, and yet it was perfect. Jake picked me up in his old truck, the interior smelling faintly of sawdust and engine oil, and took me to a small Italian restaurant on the edge of town. The place was cozy, with checkered tablecloths and flickering candlelight, and for the first time in years I felt like a woman again. Not just a widow or a mother or a grandmother, but someone who deserved to be seen. We talked and laughed over plates of pasta and glasses of wine, the conversation flowing as easily as it always did. Jake told me stories about his daughter, his childhood, his dreams for the future, and I found myself sharing parts of myself I hadn't spoken of in years. By the time dessert arrived, I was smiling so much my cheeks hurt. You're beautiful when you smile, Jake said, his voice quiet but firm. I felt my face flush, the compliment catching me off guard. Jake? I mean it, he said, his eyes holding mine. You're beautiful, Margaret. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything. Instead, I reached across the table, my hand finding his. And for the first time, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't as impossible as it seemed. The night ended with Jake walking me to my door, his hand warm against the small of my back. We stood on the porch for a long moment, neither of us wanting to say goodbye. Thank you for tonight, I said, my voice soft. It was wonderful. It was, he agreed, his gaze steady. I'd like to do it again, if you're up for it. I smiled, my heart feeling lighter than it had in years. I'd like that. As he stepped off the porch and walked to his truck, I watched him go, a quiet hope blooming in my chest. For the first time in a long time, the future felt bright. If the future felt bright. The days that followed were like something out of a dream. Jake and I settled into an unspoken rhythm, our days punctuated by shared laughter, quiet moments, and the occasional dinner that felt more like a celebration than a simple meal. It was as if the house itself had come alive, filled with the energy he brought into my world. For the first time in years, I found myself looking forward to each day, not just because of Jake, though he was a large part of it, but because of how he made me feel. I started tending to the little things I'd long ignored. My garden flourished, the house sparkled, and I even began baking again, rediscovering the simple joy of creating something with my hands. Jake noticed. "You're glowing, Margaret," he said one afternoon as we sat on the porch, the warm breeze carrying the scent of freshly cut grass. "Am I?" I asked, laughing softly. "You are," he said, his eyes warm and sincere. "It's nice to see." Ah, I didn't know how to respond, so I simply smiled, letting his words wash over me. But not everything was as simple as it seemed. While I basked in the warmth of Jake's affection, a small voice in the back of my mind warned me that this was too good to last. It wasn't just the age difference, though that was daunting enough. It was the practicalities of our lives, the ways in which they didn't quite fit together. Jake had a young daughter to think about, a career that kept him busy, and a future that stretched out before him in ways I couldn't imagine. I, on the other hand, had lived most of my life already. I had memories, stories, and a lifetime of experiences. But my path was winding down, while his was still being paved. The disparity felt impossible to ignore. One evening, as we sat in the living room with a bottle of wine between us, I decided to address the elephant in the room. "Jake," I began hesitantly, my fingers tracing the rim of my glass. "What are we doing?" He frowned slightly, setting his glass down. "What do you mean?" "This," I said, gesturing between us. "Us. I can't help but feel like I'm holding you back from something." Jake leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Margaret, if I thought for a second that you were holding me back, I wouldn't be here. I'm here because I want to be." His words were reassuring, but they didn't quiet the doubts gnawing at me. "But what about Lily? What about your future? Have you thought about what people will say?" Jake's expression softened. "I've thought about it, and you know what I keep coming back to? It doesn't matter. People are going to talk no matter what. What matters is how I feel when I'm with you. And Margaret, I feel alive when I'm with you." I felt my throat tighten, emotion threatening to overwhelm me. "Jake, You don't have to say anything," he interrupted gently, his hand covering mine. "I know this isn't easy. I know it's complicated, but I'm willing to face it, if you are." I looked into his eyes, searching for any trace of doubt, but all I saw was unwavering determination. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once, and I realized I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that this could work, that we could defy the odds and carve out a space for ourselves in a world that didn't always make room for the unexpected. "Okay," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "Let's see where this takes us." Jake's smile was slow but radiant, and in that moment, I felt the weight of my doubts begin to lift. It was life, experiencing itself. For a time, things felt almost normal, whatever normal meant for us. Jake and I continued to spend time together, slipping into a routine that felt both comforting and thrilling. He introduced me to Lily one sunny afternoon, and I was struck by how much she resembled him. She was a whirlwind of energy, her laugh infectious, and I found myself instantly charmed by her. "She likes you," Jake said later, as we watched her play in the garden. "She's wonderful," I replied, my heart swelling with affection. "You've done a good job with her, Jake." His expression softened and he reached for my hand. "I couldn't have done it without you, Margaret." The moment was perfect, too perfect perhaps, because as much as I wanted to lose myself in the happiness we'd found, the world had a way of reminding me that perfection was fleeting. The sun setting and the air turning dark. The first crack appeared when my son David came to visit. He arrived unannounced, his usual briskness tempered by an underlying tension I couldn't quite place. "Mom," he said after a perfunctory hug, his gaze scanning the house. "It's been too long." "It has," I agreed, though I couldn't ignore the way his eyes lingered on the small changes Jake had brought into my life. The fresh flowers on the table, the new curtains in the living room, the faint scent of cedar wood that still clung to the air. "Are you seeing someone?" he asked bluntly, catching me off guard. I hesitated, unsure how to respond. Yes, I suppose I am." David's expression darkened. "Who is he?" "His name is Jake," I said, my voice steady despite the rapid thudding of my heart. "He's been helping me around the house. We've grown close." "How close?" David pressed, his tone sharp. "Close enough," I replied, my patience wearing thin. "David, I know this might be hard for you to understand, but Jake makes me happy. Isn't that what matters?" "Mom, he's—" David stopped himself, shaking his head. "He's too young for you. This doesn't make sense." "It makes sense to me," I said firmly, "and that's all that matters." David looked at me, his expression a mixture of disbelief and disappointment. "I just don't want to see you get hurt." "I appreciate your concern," I said, softening my tone. "But I'm not asking for your permission, David. This is my life." He didn't say anything else, but the tension lingered long after he left. His disapproval weighed on me, a stark reminder of the challenges Jake and I would face if we continued down this path. That evening, as Jake and I sat on the porch, I told him about David's visit. His jaw tightened, but he nodded, his expression resolute. "I figured this would happen sooner or later," he said. "People are going to have opinions, Margaret, but the only ones that matter are ours." "I know," I said, though the weight of David's words still lingered. "But it's hard, Jake. It's hard knowing that the people I care about don't understand." Jake reached for my hand, his grip strong and steady. "Then, let's show them. Let's show them that this," he gestured between us, "is real. That it works." His confidence was infectious, and for the first time since David's visit, I felt a spark of hope. Maybe Jake was right. Maybe we could prove them wrong. Damn. But life, as it often does, had other plans. The next morning, I received a call from my neighbor Susan. Her voice was tight with concern as she relayed what she'd overheard at the grocery store. "People are talking, Margaret," she said. "They've seen Jake coming and going, and they're speculating." My stomach sank, the fragile peace I'd found with Jake threatening to shatter. "Speculating about what?" "You know how people are," Susan said carefully. "They're saying it's inappropriate, given the age difference. That it's unseemly." The words stung more than I cared to admit. I thanked Susan for the call, hanging up before my voice betrayed me. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, my mind racing. Could I really weather the storm that was brewing? Could Jake? I didn't know the answers, but as I stared out the window, watching the roses we'd planted together sway in the breeze, I realized one thing. I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. For the first time since Jake had entered my life, Doubt began to creep in. It wasn't his fault. Jake was as steadfast as ever, his quiet confidence a constant source of comfort. But the whispers in the neighborhood, David's disapproval, and my own fears of judgment felt like a weight pressing down on me. It was as if every moment of happiness was accompanied by the shadow of what others might think. I tried to ignore it, to push through, but the tension was palpable. Jake noticed, of course. He always noticed. "You've been quiet lately," he said one evening as we sat on the porch, the setting sun casting a warm glow over the garden. "Is everything okay?" I hesitated, unsure how much to tell him. "It's just... people are talking," I admitted finally. "Susan called me yesterday. She said the neighbors have been gossiping about us." Jake's jaw tightened, his gaze shifting to the horizon. "I figured that might happen." "It's not just the neighbors," I continued, my voice trembling. "David was here the other day. He's worried about me, about us." Jake turned to me, his eyes steady and unflinching. "And what about you, Margaret? Are you worried?" I looked down at my hands, twisting them in my lap. "I don't know. I thought I could handle it, but now I'm not so sure." Jake reached for my hand, his grip warm and reassuring. "We don't have to do this if it's too much for you," he said softly. "I don't want to make your life harder, Margaret. I just want to make it better." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, the sincerity in his voice both heartbreaking and beautiful. "You do make it better," I said, tears welling in my eyes. "That's what makes this so hard." Jake didn't say anything, but the way he held my hand, his thumb brushing gently over my knuckles, spoke volumes. He wasn't going to give up on me, not unless I asked him to. The next few days were a blur of emotions. I tried to carry on as if nothing had changed, but the weight of the situation was always there, lurking in the back of my mind. Jake continued to stop by on borrowed time. Then, one afternoon, Lily came to visit. Jake had brought her over to help me with the garden, her boundless energy a welcome distraction. She ran through the yard with a watering can almost as big as she was, her laughter filling the air. "You're really good with her," Jake said as we watched her from the porch. "She loves spending time here." "She's a wonderful girl," I replied, smiling despite myself. "You've done an amazing job raising her, Jake." He looked at me then, his expression thoughtful. "I couldn't have done it without you, Margaret. You've been such a big part of our lives these past few months. I don't think I realized how much we needed you until you were here." The honesty in his voice was almost too much to bear. I turned away, blinking back tears. "I needed you too," I admitted softly. "More than I realized." But as much as I wanted to hold on to the happiness Jake and Lily had brought into my life, the outside world refused to stay at bay. One morning, I found a note slipped under my door. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the message was clear. "People are talking. This isn't right." And that's when I ran. Then, feeling anxious because I couldn't wait, I stared at the note for a long time, my hands trembling. The words were simple, but the impact was profound. It was one thing to know people were gossiping. It was another to have it spelled out so blatantly. When Jake arrived later that day, I showed him the note. His face darkened as he read it, his jaw clenching. "This is ridiculous," he said, crumpling the paper in his fist. "Who do they think they are?" "Jake, maybe they're right," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe this isn't right. Maybe we're being selfish." Jake turned to me, his eyes blazing. "Selfish?" "Margaret, You've spent your whole life putting everyone else first. When is it your turn to be happy?" His words struck a chord, but the doubt remained. "I don't know, Jake. I don't know if I can do this anymore." The silence that followed was deafening. Jake stared at me for a long moment before nodding slowly. "If that's how you feel, I'll respect it. But I need you to know something." "What?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I love you, Margaret," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "I don't care what anyone else thinks. I love you." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I felt my breath catch, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to say it back, to tell him I felt the same, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I watched as Jake turned and walked out the door, his shoulders heavy with disappointment. The days that followed were some of the loneliest I'd ever known. The house felt colder, emptier, without Jake's presence. I tried to convince myself that I'd made the right decision, that walking away was the only way to protect both of us. But the ache in my chest refused to fade. I found myself wandering the garden one evening, the roses we'd planted together blooming in shades of pink and red. They were a reminder of everything we'd shared, a tangible representation of the life we'd begun to build together. And as I stood there, the scent of the flowers filling the air, I realized something. I couldn't let fear dictate my life anymore. That night, I called Jake. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before he answered. His voice was cautious, almost hesitant. "Margaret, I made a mistake," I said, my voice shaking. I let other people's opinions get in the way of what I want, what I need. And what I need is you, Jake. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, I feared I'd waited too long. But then Jake spoke, his voice warm and filled with relief. "I'm glad you called." "Ah, I'm sorry." When Jake arrived the next morning, the tension between us melted away the moment our eyes met. He pulled me into his arms, holding me as if he never wanted to let go. And in that moment, I knew I'd made the right choice. We spent the day together, talking and laughing as if nothing had ever come between us. Lily joined us later, her presence a reminder of the life we were building. A life filled with love, laughter, and the courage to face whatever came our way. As the sun set over the garden, Jake took my hand, his eyes filled with determination. "We're in this together, Margaret, no matter what anyone says." I nodded, a sense of peace washing over me. The days that followed were some of the most peaceful I'd known in years. Jake and I had made our choice to face the world together, no matter the challenges. The whispers from neighbors still lingered, and David's disapproval remained a thorn in my side. But I found strength in the love we shared. For the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving, I was living. One afternoon, as Jake and I worked side by side in the garden, Lily running around us with a butterfly net, I felt a profound sense of contentment. The roses we'd planted together were in full bloom, their vibrant colors a reminder of everything we'd overcome. This little patch of earth, so carefully tended, felt like a metaphor for our relationship, fragile at first, but strong and beautiful with care. "You know," Jake said, brushing soil from his hands, "I was thinking about something." The 2 strangers, staring back at him without seeming to notice. "You?" "What's that?" I asked, wiping sweat from my brow. "Maybe it's time we gave people something to talk about," he said with a grin, his eyes sparkling with mischief. I laughed, shaking my head. Haven't we done enough of that already? I'm serious, he said, his tone softening. I want the world to know how much you mean to me, Margaret. I don't want to hide it anymore. His words took me by surprise, but the sincerity in his voice left no room for doubt. Jake, I began, unsure of what to say. He reached for my hand, his grip warm and steady. I love you, he said simply. And I want everyone to know it. Tears welled in my eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude, of joy, of a love I never thought I'd find again. I love you too, I said, my voice trembling. I don't care what anyone else thinks. As long as I have you, I have everything I need. Word of our relationship spread quickly after that, but this time I didn't let the gossip bother me. Jake and I faced it head on, presenting ourselves as a united front. To my surprise, the initial shock from my neighbors eventually gave way to reluctant acceptance. It seemed that seeing us together, happy and unashamed, was enough to change a few minds. Even David, who had been my harshest critic, began to come around. It wasn't an easy journey. Our conversations were often tense, and his protective instincts clashed with his understanding of my need for happiness. But over time, he saw how much Jake cared for me, how genuine our connection was, and he began to soften. I still don't fully understand it, David admitted one evening over dinner, but I can see that he makes you happy, Mom, and that's all I've ever wanted for you. His words were a balm to my heart, and I reached across the table to squeeze his hand. Thank you, David. That means more to me than you know. As the weeks turned into months, our little family found its rhythm. Jake moved in, bringing his warmth and laughter into a house that had long felt too quiet. Lily became a fixture in my life, her boundless energy and curiosity filling the days with joy. She'd taken to calling me Grandma Margaret, a title that filled me with pride. Life wasn't without its challenges, of course. The age gap between Jake and me still raised eyebrows, and there were moments when our differences felt like hurdles to overcome. But we faced them together, our love a source of strength that carried us through even the toughest days. One evening, as we sat in the garden, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Jake took my hand and said, "You know, Margaret, I used to think my life was set, that I'd just raise Lily, work until I couldn't anymore, and that'd be it. But you've shown me that there's so much more out there, so much more to hope for." "You've given me hope too," I replied, my voice thick with emotion. "I thought my time for love had passed, but you've shown me that it's never too late to find happiness." He leaned in and kissed me, the moment simple but profound. And as I sat there, surrounded by the life we'd built together, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we'd face them together. Our story wasn't conventional, and it wasn't without its share of struggles. But it was ours, beautiful, messy, and filled with a love that defied expectations. And as I watched Jake and Lily laughing together in the garden, their joy echoing through the air, I realized that I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. This was my second chance at happiness, and I was going to cherish every moment of it. This concludes the resolution of the story, tying together Margaret and Jake's journey with a hopeful and satisfying ending. Let me know if you'd like further adjustments or additional elements. You said, A twist 1000. ChatGPT said, "Here's the twist, adding depth and complexity to the story while maintaining the emotional resonance." This 1,000-word segment introduces an unexpected revelation that tests Margaret and Jake's relationship and their resolve. Written by the 72-year-old woman lost control with her plumber, and directed by. Life with Jake had settled into a comfortable rhythm. The days were brighter, the house livelier, and my heart fuller than it had been in decades. But just when I thought I'd found my happily ever after, life threw me an unexpected curveball. It began with a knock at the door, sharp, insistent, and unfamiliar. Jake was in the garden with Lily, so I answered it, expecting a neighbor or a delivery. Instead, I found a young woman standing on the porch, her face pale and strained, her hands gripping a crumpled envelope. "Are you Margaret Harris?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. "I am," I replied cautiously. "Can I help you?" The woman hesitated, her eyes darting past me to the sound of Jake and Lily laughing in the distance. She seemed to steel herself before thrusting the envelope toward me. "My name is Sarah," she said. "I need to talk to you about Jake." Sighing, she looked down. Her words sent a chill down my spine. I took the envelope with trembling hands and stepped aside to let her in. She perched on the edge of the couch, her nervous energy filling the room. "What is this about?" I asked, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. Sarah looked at me, her eyes brimming with tears. "I don't know how else to say this, so I'll just come out with it. I'm Jake's ex-wife." The words hit me like a blow, stealing the air from my lungs. "His ex-wife?" I echoed, my mind racing. Jake had told me about Lily's mother leaving them, but he'd never mentioned her name, much less the possibility of her reappearing. Sarah nodded, her hands twisting in her lap. "I left Jake and Lily 3 years ago. It was the biggest mistake of my life, and now I want to make things right." My stomach churned as her words sank in. What does that mean exactly? "It means I want to be a part of my daughter's life again," she said, her voice cracking. "I've been in therapy. I've gotten my life together. And I want to be there for Lily. I want to fix what I broke." My thoughts were a chaotic swirl of confusion and fear. I knew this wasn't about me. Lily deserved to have her mother in her life if that's what was best for her. But I couldn't ignore the implications of Sarah's return. What would it mean for Jake? For us? "Does Jake know you're here?" I asked finally. Sarah shook her head. "Not yet. I wanted to talk to you first. I needed you to understand that I'm not here to hurt anyone. I just want my family back." The words hung heavy in the air, their weight pressing down on me. I wanted to lash out, to tell her she had no right to disrupt the life Jake and I had built. But I knew that wouldn't solve anything. Instead, I forced myself to stay calm. "I think you need to talk to Jake," I said, my voice tight. "This isn't my decision to make." Sarah nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Thank you, Margaret. I know this isn't easy, but I appreciate you listening." I walked her to the door, my mind a storm of emotions. As she left, I caught a glimpse of Jake in the garden, his laughter carrying through the air. My heart ached at the thought of what this news might do to him. That evening, I sat Jake down and told him everything. His reaction was immediate. Shock, anger, and a deep sadness that seemed to radiate from him. "She wants to come back?" he asked, his voice strained. "After all this time?" "She says she's changed," I said gently, "that she wants to be a part of Lily's life again." Jake ran a hand through his hair, his expression torn. "I don't know if I can believe that. She left us, Margaret. She didn't just leave me. She left Lily. How do I trust her now? Experience every sensation as it comes, she said. I don't have the answer to that, I admitted. But I think you owe it to yourself and to Lily to hear her out. Jake nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping under the weight of the decision. You're right. I don't want this to affect what we have, Margaret. You mean so much to me. His words brought tears to my eyes, and I reached for his hand. Jake, I'm not going anywhere. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. The next few days were tense as Jake arranged to meet Sarah. When the day finally arrived, I stayed home, giving them the space they needed. The hours dragged by, every tick of the clock a reminder of the uncertainty hanging over us. When Jake returned, his expression was unreadable. He sat beside me on the couch, silent for a long moment before finally speaking. She seems sincere, he said quietly. She says she wants to be there for Lily, to make up for lost time, but I don't know if I can forgive her. Not yet. You don't have to forgive her all at once, I said, placing a hand on his arm. Take it one step at a time. See if her actions match her words. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the floor. I told her she could spend time with Lily, supervised for now. I need to see how this goes before I let her back into our lives completely. I squeezed his arm, my heart aching for him. That's a good start, Jake. And no matter what happens, I'm here for you. If everyone... The weeks that followed were a test of patience and resilience. Sarah began visiting Lily under Jake's watchful eye, and, to my surprise, she seemed genuine in her efforts to reconnect. Lily, though initially hesitant, began warming to her mother, her natural curiosity overcoming her wariness. It wasn't easy to watch. There were moments when I felt like an outsider, wondering if there was still a place for me in Jake's life now that Sarah was back. But Jake never wavered in his commitment to me, his actions a constant reminder of the love we shared. I'm not going back to her, he told me one evening as we sat in the garden. That part of my life is over. What I have with you, Margaret, it's real. It's what I want. His words eased the fears I hadn't realized I was carrying, and I leaned into him, finding comfort in his presence. I believe you, Jake, and I'm here, no matter what. In the end, Sarah's return didn't break us. If anything, it strengthened our bond, forcing us to confront the challenges of our relationship head on. We learned to navigate the complexities of our blended lives, finding a balance that worked for everyone. And as I sat with Jake and Lily one sunny afternoon, watching them laugh and play in the garden, I realized that love isn't always simple or easy, but it's worth fighting for. The days following Sarah's reappearance were tense, a delicate balancing act of emotions and expectations. Jake and I did our best to maintain our bond while navigating the uncertain terrain Sarah's return had created. Lily was at the center of it all, her laughter and curiosity grounding us, even as the weight of the situation bore down on us. But the confrontation I'd been dreading came sooner than I expected. It was a Saturday morning when Sarah arrived unannounced. I was in the garden, tending to the roses, when I heard the sound of her car pulling into the driveway. Jake and Lily were out running errands, and for a moment, I considered pretending I wasn't home. But that wasn't me. I wasn't one to hide, and I wasn't about to start now. I wiped my hands on my apron and walked to the front door, finding Sarah standing there with a hesitant expression. She was holding a folder, her fingers gripping it tightly, as if it were the only thing keeping her steady. "Margaret," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I need to talk to you." I nodded, stepping aside to let her in. We sat in the living room, the space between us heavy with unspoken words. "I wanted to thank you," Sarah began, her gaze fixed on the folder in her lap, "for giving me the chance to see Lily again. I know I don't deserve it, but it means more to me than I can say." "You should be thanking Jake," I replied evenly. "He's the one who made that decision." "I know," she said, her voice soft, "but you've been part of his life, of Lily's life. And I know this hasn't been easy for you either." I stayed silent, unsure of where this was going. Sarah took a deep breath, opening the folder and sliding a piece of paper across the table. "This is a letter I wrote to Jake before I left," she said, her voice trembling. "I never gave it to him. I was too ashamed. But I think you should read it." I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the paper. The last thing I wanted was to wade further into the mess Sarah had created. But the raw emotion in her voice compelled me. I unfolded the letter and began to read. The words on the page were a mix of regret and desperation, a confession of the struggles Sarah had faced and the pain she carried. She spoke of feeling unworthy, of running away because she didn't know how to face her own failures. It was a portrait of a woman lost in her own darkness, searching for a way out, but too afraid to ask for help. When I finished reading, I looked up to find Sarah watching me, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I was a coward," she said quietly. "I left because I didn't know how to stay, and now I'm trying to make up for it. But I know I can't erase what I did." I didn't know what to say. Her honesty was disarming, and though I wanted to hold on to my resentment, I found it slipping through my fingers. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked finally. "Because I need you to understand," she said. "I know I don't have the right to ask for anything, but I want to be a part of Lily's life, and I don't want to come between you and Jake. I need him to forgive me, even if it's just for Lily's sake." Her words hit me harder than I expected. For all her flaws and mistakes, Sarah was still Lily's mother, and it was clear she was trying to make amends. "I can't speak for Jake," I said finally, "but I can tell you this. Forgiveness takes time. If you're sincere about wanting to make things right, then show him. Show Lily. Words only mean so much." Sarah nodded, her shoulders sagging with relief. "Thank you, Margaret. I won't forget this." Later that day, I told Jake about Sarah's visit. He listened quietly as I recounted her words, his expression a mix of anger and sorrow. "She gave you the letter?" he asked, his voice tight. "Yes," I said, handing it to him. "She wanted me to read it first." "I think she's trying, Jake. I think she really wants to make things right." Jake unfolded the letter, his eyes scanning the page. I watched as his face softened, the tension in his jaw easing as he absorbed her words. When he finished, he set the paper down and leaned back in his chair, letting out a long sigh. "I don't know if I can ever fully forgive her," he said, his voice low, "but maybe I can start. That's all anyone can ask," I said, gently. In the weeks that followed, Sarah continued her efforts to rebuild her relationship with Lily. She showed up consistently, kept her promises, and slowly began to earn Jake's trust. It wasn't an easy process. There were moments of doubt, of frustration, but progress was being made. For my part, I tried to stay supportive without getting in the way. Jake and I had weathered enough storms to know that our love was strong, but I also understood that his relationship with Sarah, complicated as it was, would always be tied to Lily. And if I loved Jake, I had to accept that. One evening, as we sat in the garden watching Lily chase fireflies, Jake reached for my hand. I felt something shift in the plants around us. "I couldn't have done this without you," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "You've been my rock, Margaret, through everything." "And you're stronger than you think, Jake," I replied, my voice soft. "But I'll always be here for you." The final confrontation came on a sunny afternoon when Sarah asked to speak with both Jake and me. We met in the garden, the roses in full bloom around us, their vibrant colors a backdrop to the seriousness of the moment. "I want to thank you both," Sarah began, her voice steady, "for giving me the chance to be part of Lily's life again. It's more than I deserve, and I'll never take it for granted." Jake nodded, his expression calm but guarded. "You've been doing well, Sarah. Lily's happy. That's what matters." "I want you to know," Sarah continued, looking at me now, "that I have no intention of interfering with your relationship. You've been wonderful for Jake, for Lily, and I see how much they mean to you." Her words took me by surprise, but I could see the sincerity in her eyes. "Thank you, Sarah," I said simply. "That means a lot." There was a long pause, the three of us standing together in the garden, the weight of the past hanging between us. And then, slowly, it began to lift. We weren't perfect, we weren't even close, but we were trying, and that was enough. As the sun set that evening, Jake and I sat together on the porch, his arm around my shoulders, as we watched the sky turn shades of orange and pink. Lily's laughter drifted up from the garden, a sound that filled my heart with joy. "We've come a long way," Jake said, his voice thoughtful. "We have," I agreed, leaning into him, "and we've still got a long way to go." He smiled, pressing a kiss to my temple. "As long as I've got you, I'm ready for anything." And in that moment, I knew we'd be okay. We'd faced the past, embraced the present, and found the strength to build a future together. Whatever came next, we'd face it, hand in hand.